Welcome back to Dieu Han RV. Thank you for spending time with us once again to follow the journey of a young mother who has been through more pain than most ever will. This is a place where compassion meets courage, and silence hides more truth than words ever could. After meeting with the police, Dieu Han was left in quiet uncertainty, but then knew that every second mattered. He set off alone, determined to find answers before it was too late. And somewhere else, another man made a silent vow to abandon everything, just to find Yen before the darkness caught her. This new chapter is not just about survival, it's about love tested by distance, and loyalty pushed to the edge. Can Yen hold on long enough to be found? Or will the road swallow her before help arrives? Only time will tell, but every footstep echoes with hope. If you believe in second chances, and in the quiet strength of those who never give up, this journey will speak to your heart. Many are still lost in this world, not just on the streets, but in life itself. And sometimes, a single voice, a single share, can lead someone home. Please hit like, subscribe to Dieu Han RV, and turn on the notification bell. Your support helps these stories reach those who need them the most. Merchant lay back on the hammock, eyes fixed on the ceiling, but his mind was miles away. The debts were piling up fast, and the payment deadline loomed like a guillotine. Every option felt like a dead end. Except one. A reckless plan had started forming in his head, something that could change everything overnight if it worked. But if it failed, it might drag him down for good. The rain had just stopped when a young man walked slowly into the yard. He looked hesitant but determined, glancing around before stepping up to the porch. He introduced himself as someone who used to be very close to Yen, his voice laced with concern. He hadn't been able to contact her for days, and that silence gnawed at him until he could no longer sit still. He stood respectfully in front of Mr. Chen, asking calmly if Yen was home or if she had mentioned going anywhere. The old man raised his eyes, feigning surprise, then shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For a brief moment, a flicker of something crossed his face, unease, maybe even guilt. But then he waved it off, brushing the question aside as if it meant nothing. Merchant sat with a tightened jaw, avoiding eye contact as the young man pressed on about Yen. Beside him, Mrs. Chin stepped closer, trying to stay calm, but her voice betrayed concern. The air between them thickened. They knew something was wrong, and the young man's questions were only getting sharper. Behind the silence, there was a truth they weren't ready to face. A truth that could destroy everything if it were spoken aloud. Mrs. Jin finally broke the silence, asking if he had any news about her daughter. Her voice trembled, a mother's fear leaking through every word. Merchant clenched his fists under the table, clearly uncomfortable. The young man hesitated for a moment, then spoke gently about Yen's disappearance. The word missing hung in the air like a cold wind. And for the first time, Mrs. Jin's face crumbled. Her worst fear was no longer just a thought. Tears welled up in Mrs. Jin's eyes as she turned to the young man. Her voice cracked as she pleaded, begging him to help find her daughter. She held nothing back, speaking with the desperation only a mother could understand. "Please, I have no one else to turn to," she whispered. Her hands trembled as she reached across the table. This wasn't just a favor. It was a cry for redemption, one last hope to bring her daughter back. She lowered her voice, eyes darting toward Mr. Chin, who sat in cold silence. "He's the reason my daughter's gone," she said, each word laced with pain. "He forced her into that marriage. He knew the danger." Her body trembled, not just from grief but from years of silence cracking open. The young man sat still, absorbing every word. The room grew heavy, like the truth had finally seeped through the walls. A truth too painful to bury any longer. He stood up slowly, looked Mrs. Chin in the eyes, and said with quiet strength, "Don't worry. I'll find Yen. I promise." His words were steady, but the weight behind them was immense. He gave a respectful nod to both of them, then turned and walked away. There was no need for more words. In that moment, his silence carried the weight of 1,000 promises, of friendship, of loyalty, and of a vow to make things right. Then arrived at the small house tucked behind rows of banana trees, heart pounding gently with purpose. He recognized the motorbike parked in front and knocked softly. An older man stepped out, surprised but not unkind. Than gave him a slight bow, showing respect. Their eyes met, and in that moment, gratitude said more than words. The man nodded once, stepping aside to let Than in. Some debts were deeper than money, they were owed in sincerity. The man recognized Than immediately and smiled. Last time, Than had no wallet, drenched and exhausted, yet the driver didn't hesitate to help. Today, Than returned not just with money, but with gratitude. He handed the folded bills with both hands, bowing slightly. "I didn't forget," he said sincerely. The man chuckled and waved him off, but Than insisted. It wasn't about the money, it was about honor. Sometimes, repaying kindness meant healing a part of your own store. Than didn't press for conversation. He understood that sometimes, actions were enough. The older man finally smiled, just a little, and said, "You're a good kid." That simple sentence felt like a blessing. Than stood up, gave another respectful nod, and said goodbye. As he walked away, there was a lightness in his step, not because the debt was paid, but because he honored it. Some journeys start not from plans, but from respect. The quiet rain fell steadily, cooling Than's tired body, as if rinsing away the exhaustion and silent pressure he had carried for days. Moran's footsteps slowed as he passed a high brick wall, his instincts suddenly on alert. From the other side, a faint rustle of grass echoed unnaturally. He didn't stop, but his mind was racing. Was he being watched again? The path he was taking felt too exposed, yet turning back would raise suspicion. He had learned not to act on fear, but to move with purpose. And this time, his purpose was Yen. He just had to keep walking. Just beyond the next turn, Mr. N felt it again, the weight of a gaze pressing on his back. He didn't need to look, he knew someone was there. Across the road, a figure leaned slightly from behind tall grass, watching. They were close. Too close. Yet Mr. N showed no sign of panic. He walked steadily, calmly, trusting that whoever was behind him still didn't know how much he already suspected. But inside, every step was a calculation for survival. He turned onto a narrow village road, pretending to check his phone, but his eyes scanned the shadows. In that quiet moment, Mr. N caught the briefest movement, a shadow ducking behind a tree. No sunglasses, no disguise, just a man watching from afar. Whoever he wasn't hiding well enough. Murat had seen enough to know this wasn't random. He wasn't just walking anymore. He was leading, luring. To find Yen, he had to stay one step ahead. Just as Mr. N tried to keep walking naturally, the hum of a motorbike approached from behind. The rider pulled up beside him, cut the engine, and calmly stepped down. He wore plain clothes, but his tone was firm. He showed a badge briefly, low and fast, then introduced himself as an undercover officer investigating a kidnapping ring. Murin froze. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the weight of what this might mean. Had something happened to Yen? The officer asked if Mr. N had seen a girl named Yen, showed a photo from his pocket, and watched his reaction closely. Murin's face tightened. He nodded slowly. Yes, he knew her. Yes, he'd been trying to find her. But how did the police get involved now? And more importantly, was she already in danger again? The officer's face showed no emotion, but the questions were cutting deeper than they sounded. He hesitated only a second, then asked what the officer knew. Had they found Yen? Was she safe? But the officer shook his head, said they had leads but needed civilian help. Murin looked around, instincts flaring. He had no proof this man was who he claimed to be. Still, the urgency in the officer's voice was real. If there was even a small chance to help Yen, he couldn't afford to walk away. After gathering the details he needed, the officer gave a short nod and started his motorbike again. He didn't say much, just reminded Mr. N to stay alert and avoid drawing attention. Then, like a shadow fading into daylight, he rode off down the narrow path, leaving behind a trail of dust and questions. Murin stood still for a moment, staring after him, unsure if he felt more hopeful or more afraid. Murren stepped into the busy street, eyes scanning every passerby with quiet urgency. Amid the hum of motorbikes and chatter, he spotted an elderly man sitting near a makeshift tool shop. Trusting his instinct, he approached the man and gently asked if he had seen a girl named Yan. The old man squinted at the photo and leaned back thoughtfully. He said he had seen someone like her a few days ago, walking alone near the back alley of the market. She looked lost and exhausted. Murren's heart raced, every word adding weight to his hope. He thanked the man earnestly, scribbling down the location. Before leaving, Mr. N asked if the old man had noticed anything else, anyone following her, or if she spoke to anyone. The man shook his head but said he'd keep an eye out. As Mr. N walked away, the memory of Yen's tired face in the photo lingered in his thoughts like a quiet plea. Just as Mr. N was about to walk away, the motorbike driver came running after him, waving urgently. Something had just clicked in his mind. With a troubled face, he recalled the last trip he took with a young girl who looked like Yen. It was a quiet alley, far from the city noise. He hadn't thought much about it, until now. Murren's eyes lit up with a spark of urgency. This might finally be the clue they needed. The driver pointed in the direction of the alley, describing the spot with surprising detail. Murray listened intently, his mind racing with possibilities. Every word from the driver seemed like a map unfolding. He thanked the man deeply, promising to act fast. The urgency in his steps revealed how desperate he was. As he turned away, the wind carried a whisper of hope. Yen might still be somewhere out there, waiting. And now, at least, they had a place to start. Murren ran down every alley, knocked on every gate, and searched every half-built house. His breath was short, his shirt soaked. But he wouldn't stop. With each step, the urgency grew heavier. What if she was still here, trapped and afraid? He couldn't afford to slow down. Every shadow looked like her silhouette. Every silence screamed louder. The abandoned buildings echoed with emptiness, but he listened closely, just in case. A door creaked. A gust of wind blew, but no voice, no movement, nothing. Yet hope clung to him like sweat. He whispered Yen's name, voice trembling. This wasn't just a search, it was a silent promise. He would find her, or lose himself trying. Murday searched every corner of the abandoned building, eyes filled with hope and desperation. His steps echoed against the cold cement walls as if calling out to someone who might still be hiding. With each room he checked, the emptiness weighed heavier on his chest. But he refused to stop. Yen could be anywhere, and he would not forgive himself if he overlooked even the smallest sign. Then something caught his eye, a thin plastic raincoat with pink patterns, half crumpled on the dusty floor. It wasn't old or weathered, it looked recently used. And stepped closer, his pulse racing. The dampness on the surface, the small footprint near the edge, it all pointed to one thing. Yen had taken shelter here. And if luck was on his side, she might still be nearby. The signs were undeniable now. Among the dust lay a small, familiar object, her hair clip. The one Mr. N had bought for Yen on her last birthday. His chest tightened as he picked it up gently, recognizing the delicate pattern etched on its surface. It was more than just a clue. It was a cry for help, a silent plea that she had been here, waiting to be found. Will he find Yen in time, or will she vanish into the shadows forever? In this twisted journey of fate and courage, every second matters, every step is a risk. What would you do if someone you love was out there, lost and waiting? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications.